Good morning, good day, and good evening to all our attendees joining us for today's latest Data Science Central webinar. I'd like to start our event off today by thanking Actuate for sponsoring today's event. Actuate has been a longtime supporter of the Data Science Central community, and we are honored to have them sponsoring today's webinar. I'd also like to take this opportunity to mention and show our appreciation for some of our other recent sponsors, including Teradata, Tableau, TIBCO, Hortonworks, MapR, and Databricks, to name just a few. These past webinars are available on demand at datasciencecentral.com, and if you have not had an opportunity to view them, I would encourage you to do so, as they do provide some very useful information. Today's webinar is entitled Building a Customer-Centric Culture by Harnessing the Power of Big Data. And before we begin, I'd like to briefly review the format of today's webinar. Today's event will be approximately 1 hour long. We have two panelists I'll introduce to all of you in just a moment. We should have about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A following the presentation, and this event is being taped and will be made available later on this afternoon at Data Science Central. I'd also like to encourage our attendees to provide questions throughout the presentation. We will be reviewing them and presenting them on your behalf during the Q&A portion of today's event. My name is Tim Madison. I'm one of the co-founders of Data Science Central, and I'll be your host today. I'm very pleased to introduce our panelists, Tim Walters of Digital Clarity Group and Alan Bondi of Actuate. Tim is a partner and principal analyst with Digital Clarity Group. He has vast experience helping companies engage with both customers and employees, an early advocate to personalized and relevant digital experiences. He is also an expert on intranets and the future of work. His background in research, teaching, and software marketing and strategy makes Tim a valued advisor to enterprises as well as solution providers. Alan is the Vice President of Product Marketing and Innovation at Actuate, an advisor to several startups, and a former digital media and internet CMO. He started his career as a researcher and data scientist in the telecom sector and was part of the teams at McKinsey and Yankee Group that did early work on online advertising and e-commerce. Alan also runs a top-rated blog in our industry called the Small Data Group. Alan attended Brown University and holds degrees from the University of Virginia and Worcester Polytechnic Institute. Thank you for being with us. Looking forward to your presentations. The ubiquity of connectivity, content, and data has tipped the buyer-seller relationship squarely in favor of the consumer in virtually every market. In an age where customer experience and customer experience management matters more than ever, companies are scrambling to get the best picture of their customers' needs. And so they can create offers and experiences that not only drive engagement and conversions, but also beat their competitors to the punch. As the speed and responsiveness drives loyalty, building an agile, customer-centric culture is essential and begins with a new view of customers, customer-facing staffing, and especially how we tap the power of big and small data. In today's webinar, you will learn how and why ubiquity and always-on experiences are forcing brands to create new ways of thinking about customers, their data, and how we serve them, how organizations are striving to bring the power of big data to the masses to drive better insight, campaign performance, and organizational knowledge, as well as why fast is the new big when it comes to using data to empower customer-facing teams and better understanding customers and market needs. So Alan, with that, I'm going to let you proceed.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm really excited to have my colleagues here together to really think about the topic of creating a customer-centric culture and how data can power that. And I've known and worked with Tim Walters for a few years. He was a colleague of mine at Digital Clarity Group. Today it's all about the customer. To me, the game is changing in a lot of different dimensions, and Tim Walters and I are going to explore that over the next 50 minutes or so. I think if you think about customers, it's also about the role of the data that we can get from those customers, and as our host Tim just mentioned, why we believe that fast is the new big when it comes to not only understanding customers, but also personalizing experiences and delivery channels and product offers. That's all really about the customer, and the way that we need to serve customers is really understanding not only what they want, but how the data trails, the breadcrumbs can be harvested so that we can provide more compelling, more engaging experiences. So to get started, let me welcome Tim Walters, and we're going to both sort of kick off with some opening thoughts.
Great, thanks very much, Alan, and also Tim. It's a real pleasure to be taking part in this discussion, especially with my old colleague Alan Bondi from formerly from Digital Clarity Group. So just a word about Digital Clarity Group. We are a research-based analyst firm. We focus on not only the technologies, but also, perhaps even more importantly, I would say certainly more importantly, the practices, the skills, and the partnerships that might be agency or service provider partnerships that companies need in order to support customer experience management. Nearly all of the research that we produce as an analyst firm is freely available without cost on our website. So when you hear me talk about things like ubiquity, the mobile shift, the customer experience imperative, or virtually any other theme that I mentioned today, we've probably written something about it, and you can find that available on our site, or feel free just to reach out to me directly. So as you can see, we're proposing first today to kind of lay the groundwork with a discussion of how ubiquity and the democratization of data have empowered consumers and inverted the buyer-seller relationship in just the last few years. And by ubiquity, we mean primarily mobility, but you have to be careful not to reduce that to handheld devices or smart handheld devices and the mobile web. And secondly, what is the appropriate and indeed the necessary and imperative response on the part of companies and brands given this inversion of that relationship? And in short, we believe that the only viable response to empowered customers is to be customer-centric and to adapt the company culture, the organizational structure, the technologies, and the processes that will allow you to achieve the kinds of insights and make sure that you are in the position to serve customers with the relevant and exceptional interactions that they expect. And by the way, throughout this today, when I talk about companies, I mean virtually any company in any industry. There are clearly some industries such as travel and entertainment that feel more of a need to be customer-centric, but this affects everyone. It affects B2C and B2B businesses and those that are a hybrid mix of the two. And it equally affects governments and nonprofit organizations who are dealing with constituents rather than customers. Also, when I say customers, I mean prospects, those people who are not yet a customer but may be in the future. Alan?
This type of framing, obviously, this is a big trend here, and as Tim just mentioned, this is something with wide-ranging impact, and in a way, the framing that we think about at Actuate is captured in this sort of sidebar, the notion of the data-driven world, that in fact, when you think about the ability to harness all these different data sources and apply them in operational ways, that this, in fact, is driving sort of not only the next wave of marketing, but also customer experience and experience design, and even at the highest level business optimization. So even though we're focusing on sort of a slice of this in terms of the customer culture, we think this is a pretty broad trend. Now the last point here, I think, in the setup, and then I'm going to transition into Tim, and he's going to share some of his perspectives and some research, in fact, that has been developed at Digital Clarity over the last couple of years. To me, from our sort of operational view, focused in on, say, marketers and others who are very much operationalizing this data in their sort of everyday tasks, to me this means getting what might be termed the best view of customers and getting that at hand so that we can empower the whole organization to be savvy around the notion of customer experience. And we'll talk about some ways that we think this can happen, because in a way this is in contrast to sort of a quote-unquote traditional view of big data, where data was still the domain of the few and then served up to the organization. In this new model, we believe that there really is a trend towards democratization of data, which requires certain types of tools for the non-data scientists. Not that the data scientist is going away, nothing could be further from the truth, but that we think that operational roles require different types of tools. That's where the notion of fast analytics comes in that I'll talk about. And we think about that these data sources need to be more quickly wired up so that we really can serve the so-called everyday business user, business professional for everyday tasks. And this is sort of a sub-theme that I'm going to explore in my portion of the presentation as well. But with this setup, let me transition over to Tim, who's going to share sort of some top-level thoughts on the notion of ubiquity, which I think is fundamental, as well as the idea of sort of always-on experiences and how this is really fundamentally changing the way that we both interact with and think about customers.
Right. So let's just look at, review the dramatic and not so many years ago, unforeseen changes that we've all lived through in just the last few years. In a certain way, I hope that much of this is obvious because we are, after all, every one of us is also a consumer, and we feel empowered by the changes that have taken place just as much as all of our customers do. I often like to say that if you really want to understand what the consumer-centric web is all about and understand what makes up a really great customer experience, look into that complicated instrument called a mirror. But you have to make sure that you see yourself as a consumer. And we have a remarkable capability to forget what consumers need as soon as we enter the office, whether it's our home office or a tower somewhere, and to begin making up excuses for why things can't be changed because we don't have the budget, or it's too political, or it's too difficult, or the technology isn't mature enough, or something else. And we forget very easily or can set aside just how powerfully important it is to satisfy those emerging and constantly evolving customer demands. So it's now less than 7 years since the iPhone went on sale. It's going to be 7 years in about 24 days, and less than 6 years since the App Store transformed it from a pretty good phone into a revolutionary kind of computer in your pocket. So you may remember there wasn't an App Store. Steve Jobs actually resisted the notion of an App Store, and most of all an open App Store that anybody could develop stuff and contribute to for over a year after the release of the initial iPhone. And the embrace of these smart mobile devices, the iPhone and others, and then the parallel rise of consumer social sites such as Facebook and Twitter, and has granted voice and choice, or respectively choice and voice, to consumers, and it has completely and irrevocably inverted the power relationship between buyers and sellers. The astonishing spread of and adoption of smartphones and tablets and phablets and whatever else you want to call these mobile computing devices constitutes the so-called mobile shift. And what I want to stress here is it's really crucial to realize that, contrary to what you may have heard elsewhere, the mobile shift does not mean that the PC is dead, as I think was announced on the cover of Wired magazine a couple of years ago. It does not mean that we're shifting away from one type of computer, like desktops and laptop computers, to a different type, a smaller one that you can put into your pocket. What it means, rather, is that whatever device you use, whatever device you want to use, whether it's the desktop, a phone, a tablet, your smartwatch, your heads-up display, whatever is most convenient at the time, computing services and the internet and social services and consumer insights are virtually always available. And that means that content, data, information, opinions, offers, enticements are ubiquitously available as well. There's a fellow named Mark Anderson who's the chief of the Strategic News Service, and he, a couple of years ago, coined this notion of the aorta consumer, which just stands for always on real-time access. And I think that's a nice way of capturing the condition of ubiquity that we all already inhabit. As a result, we all, as consumers, have become empowered and therefore incredibly demanding and disloyal and fickle. And I don't mean disloyal in any negative sense. I think that loyalty, in the sense that companies think of it, was largely a product of ignorance for many, many years. And as soon as we have access all of the time to information about alternatives and reviews of those alternatives and really good direct access to information that allows us to make alternative choices, then that so-called loyalty is dissolved. So we've become incredibly demanding and fickle. And so, for example, in this 2011 survey that was representative of all the consumers in the United States, or perhaps in North America, but at least in the United States, 1% said, so virtually no one, said that their expectations for customer experience are always met. Now, that's a very high bar. All my expectations are always met. So more importantly, nearly 90% said, and this is in the end of 2011, said at that time not only that they would consider switching to a different provider based upon a poor customer experience, but that they had already done so. And so that number, I would bet that number is now approaching 100% some 18 months later. And in addition, almost 90%, 86%, said that they would pay extra to get great customer experience. And they said, in fact, that they were asked, how much extra would you pay? Up to 25%. So that's where we've come in a very short period of time. 90% of consumers are willing to pay you to improve the quality of the customer experiences that you offer to them. So this is the way that we put it in one of the reports that I produced called the Customer Experience Management Imperative. So let me just read this quickly. Consumers are empowered by information and shared opinions, and they are emboldened by choice. They have developed an appetite for rich and rewarding interactions, and they rarely hesitate to seek alternatives when disappointed. Increasingly, companies will succeed and fail according to the quality of the digital experiences that they offer. And I would say not only digital experiences, but customer experiences across the board, some of which are analog. And we're also beginning to get some notion of the financial impact on companies that fail to perform up to those evolving expectations. So in a 2012 survey, and this was a global survey of over 1,300 executives worldwide, they were asked to estimate the cost to their company of not providing consistent, positive, brand-relevant experiences. And altogether, they said, on average, 20% of revenue. Now, you can do the math for your own company, but whether it's 50 million or 250 million or $1 billion or $5 billion in revenue, whatever it is, it's an astonishing number. Even for a $50 billion company, that's for a $50 million company, that's $10 million per year lost to inadequate customer experiences. So consumers are demanding and fickle, and companies will lose if they don't respond. What do we really want as consumers and as customers? So this is a very interesting result from a survey in 2012 in the UK. 74% of the consumers surveyed said that they would respond positively to companies who understand them, and note 84% said that they would no longer buy from a company that did not understand them. And here, it all obviously all depends upon what understanding means, but they defined understanding very carefully in this survey as taking account of preferences, purchase history, and other provided information. In other words, the consumers reward companies and who appear to know them, who treat them as if they are known, and they punish companies who do not behave in that way. And finally, a more recent survey, actually from 2014, Accenture's Global Consumer Pulse Report. So this is, again, a global survey, I think, of 33,000 consumers in 99 countries, something like that, but don't quote me yet. So they were asked, what are the sources of your frustration? So when you're having inadequate or unsatisfactory experiences in your interactions with a company, why is that the case? So 80% said they're irritated with companies setting false promises, that is, not carrying through on the promises that they make in one way or another in one channel or touch point or another. And 80% as well said they're irritated by companies asking the same questions or marketing the same offer across different channels. But interestingly enough, they're also, 65%, are irritated by inconsistent offers or content, presumably across various channels. So if this isn't a contradiction, I think what it means is that, again, you need to offer relevant information. So if you've shown me something over and over again that I'm not interested in, it's irritating. But at the same time, I want there to be a consistency of the information that's being provided to me. And to get to what we normally call personalization, although I prefer to call it relevance, nearly 3/4 said that they're irritated by site content that has nothing to do with their interest. So the kind of takeaway from all of this is that consumers favor experiences that exhibit what we call the 3 C's: consistency, coherency, and contextuality. So what does that mean? Consistent in terms of information and brand message. So as we just saw in the Accenture report, I don't want to find, for example, one insurance policy description on the website and another in a brochure and a third in an email or something like that. Coherent in terms of a unified experience and a unified kind of narrative across my interactions with the company. And that includes that the company needs to live up to and kind of be true to its brand promise. And then contextual in terms of recognizing my desires, needs, goals, and context, where I am now and what I'm trying to achieve and what my task orientation is, and all of the other previous interactions that you've had with me that could contribute to you understanding what it is precisely that I need now in the moment of the interaction. So with that idea of what it takes to please customers and prospects, let's see in the second part how data can help you do it. Alan?
So this is a perfect segue, and I think the last point, especially the notion of being contextual. To me, this is essential not only for consumers, but also sort of customer-facing staff to understand sort of this whole view of the customer, understand where the customer is in the life cycle, and then really having the right information at your fingertips so you can do very rapid planning or defining a target list or creating a campaign offer, et cetera. I'll sort of segue in with a question for you, Dr. Tim, is contextual also very much about sort of customer staff and the organization as it is about the consumer?
I have to say I don't understand the question.
So I'm going to draw out the notion of the last point of your C's. Is being contextual also essential, I guess, to the organization and the tools that they expose to their employees who are, in fact, customer-facing as much as the consumers
absolutely.
themselves?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, as in most things, as consumers, we experience the surface level result of a bunch of very, very hard work and data and information and content assets and so forth that go into the creation of the experience that the company is offering us. So clearly, if the end results that I perceive as a consumer in an interaction with your company, Alan, is that it is contextual and relevant for me, then a whole bunch of your employees had to be armed with the right information and the right tools and in inhabiting the right kinds of processes in order to make that happen.
Yeah, and it's interesting because just a capper on this point is it seems like organizations who've done a particularly good job of being customer-centric, these sort of experience companies, and we know them when we experience them, whether you're talking about Starbucks or Zappos or to some degree Amazon or luxury car makers. What I've heard is I've talked to people in that space, and culturally you have to sort of internally mirror the type of experience that you'd like to deliver externally to your customers. You can't sort of fake it internally and be very customer-centric externally. You have to make that pervasive across the organization. I think to me that's what we're talking about in terms of really being customer-centric. It's not just what things look like on the outside, it's also how things are operating on the inside.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct.
So as Tim mentioned, we wanted to touch on the next part, sort of a little bit of a segue into some research that I actually helped to direct in collaboration with Tim Walters and some of my former colleagues at Digital Clarity, a study that we did really to investigate the notion of how do we take the data that's all around us, how do we take the power of big data in all of its forms and all of its definitions and really deliver that to the masses, not only to our organization and customer-facing teams, but in some cases even out to end consumers. And what can we learn when we start to think about operationalizing that? And this was based on a number of interviews that we did, some primary research, secondary research, and we thought this would be sort of an interesting segue between the consumer point of view that Tim just talked about, this sort of dynamic on the customer side, and also the changes that we're seeing organizationally as people try to get their arms around the potential of big data, but really deliver it down to specific functional needs within the organization. And to get started, it's sort of built on the notion that we talk a lot about the 3 V's of data and big data, but in a lot of ways the last mile of big data is where the value is created, and that last mile is defined by the toolkits, the sandboxes for the customer teams that are trying to get this better view of customers. The last mile is also defined by the experiences that we can create when we're delivering sort of data-driven insights or data-driven offers, for example. And so this was sort of a top-level, I guess, observation from the study that we need to focus on that last mile, number one. We need to also, in a lot of cases, get inspired by what's happening with consumer applications, some of the trends that Tim talked about in terms of how can we make things so simple for an employee, for a customer-facing team member, so that it almost has a feel of a consumer app, that they can interact with their data, they can get just the answer they want, and then they can essentially make this new insight very much operational in terms of how it informs the external-facing experiences, campaigns, offers, et cetera. And to me, one of those takeaways that was validated is we really have to empower users, whether they're internally or externally, with visuals and visual elements. And that, in a number of ways, is sort of step one in terms of sort of taking the power of data and making it very consumable. I'm curious whether Tim, you have some top-level takeaways as well.
Yeah, I hope I'm not anticipating something you're going to say later on, but this entire notion of small data that you've not only written about but partially, I think, founded is very striking. And it seems to me that, my way of understanding that is that the smallness of small data is just about making the results of data analytics and data insights, whatever size of the data set that you're starting with, whether it's truly big or not so big, but making those things, human-sized so they can be actionable. And human-sized can mean various things. You can almost think about it in terms of the consumerization of IT. That, as you said, it's like an app-like experience. So if we're expecting a marketer or another kind of employee to actually be able to take some kind of action to improve a customer experience because of a data input, then that has to be presented to them in a way that they can understand, that they can manipulate, that they can then divine what kind of action is appropriate to take based upon the data that's presented to them.
Yeah, and I love the notion of human size, because I think if you think about sort of, to me, one of the takeaways of this study was how can we make, and it's the call-out quote right here, how can we make apps simple enough for users who aren't super technical to get just that information that they need. And I think in the notion of just the information, that's very much human size. It's task specific, it's role specific in a lot of ways. It might even be personalized, but I think this is exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah.
The other
and that goes right back to your earlier, sorry, Alan, but that goes right back to your earlier question about matching up, what you're trying to offer to the outside with what you're setting up on the inside. That is, in this case, when we say that we want a marketer or another employee to get just the information they need. In other words, we want to give them what is relevant to them. And that's exactly what we want to do on the consumer side as well.
Well, it's funny because there's I guess, historical shift towards this, right? I think you talked very well about sort of the technologically enabled transformation of the consumer. That is very much within this sort of, I guess, timeline of big data. One of the more interesting exhibits that we created as part of the study, and this is just a little snapshot on the slide here, is this historical look. Because when we talk about big data, it's certainly not a new idea. In fact, it goes back at least 25, 30 years. When I was back in my R&D days at a telco, back in the early 90s, we were looking at knowledge discovery and databases and how machine learning could help us both understand consumer needs but also help with fraud and risk and things like that. So this isn't a new idea, but it's interesting how, like many technologies, there's this sort of natural progression between waves, if you will, or transitions from the early days where we were starting to establish definitions, foundational tools, through the social era when we started to blend in new types of data from social channels and web channels, into this sort of last wave that might be considered sort of the consumerization of big data. And I think this is really what we've seen over the last few years, very much inspired, I guess, some of the initial writing I did a couple years back around small data, because I was looking at consumer applications and sort of pondering, why can't we create business applications that are as easy to use, as compelling, as single purpose as some of these consumer apps? So I just wanted to share this because this is definitely a path towards a certain point in time. It's not like all this stuff has happened overnight.
Yeah, and we as analysts like to make up terms. So we've elsewhere in our research at DCG, we've referred to this trend as the application of applications, taking enterprise applications and recognizing not only that it's not in fact very much at all about thinking that employees demand simple-minded and colorful, user experiences or so forth, that we have to dumb it down for them. It's not about that at all. It is about realizing that the app experiences that we've been exposed to and have learned a lot from in those 6 years since the App Store opened turn out to be much more productive and useful interfaces than most of the things that we were exposed to as employees in enterprise applications up until the last few years.
Yeah, and I'm going to come back to that notion of useful, because I think that may be if we wanted to put one word on this entire discussion, to me the key for both customer-facing staff and people trying to figure out what customers really want, as well as the keys to driving adoption of whatever application or service or experience, is really starts with being useful. And I think that, if we sort of focus on that initially, I think we can go a long way. I think the other takeaway here is I'll remind people one thing, that we have an active Twitter discussion going on. Speaking of useful, it's often interesting to look at sort of what's being said on the interwebs while we have this conversation. If people want to join that conversation, there's actually quite a bit of interesting dialogue and recap at Big Data Culture is our hashtag. I guess my capstone point on this history is we really think there's a lot of foundations that are in place to make some major change, to not only drive innovation, but also create cultural change. There's a lot of tools that are in place. They haven't necessarily all been wired up, and they're not necessarily all being adopted, but I think the point is there's a neat history here, and it points to an era where I think applications, as Tim just said, are particularly useful and single purpose. And the simpler we make things, the more we have a chance to drive adoption, and adoption creates innovation and creates culture. So let me sort of leave with that point and go basically to my next point, which is this notion of a philosophy, right? So Tim mentioned small data. This is a design philosophy. This is a observation in terms of what's happening. Just putting a finer point on the notion of being useful. This is something that came out of the study. It also predates the research back to the initial piece I wrote for Forbes back in the fall of 2012. If we think about being useful, to me, it builds on 3 or 4 specific drivers, right? Being simple, smart, responsive, and social. And this is really the notion of how we can think about very user-centric design, where utility and connectivity are sort of the hallmarks. This is when we talk about small data, this is really what we're talking about. Another interesting sidebar is due to the study and getting lots of feedback, we obviously were able to create and test an actual definition for this, which has become, in a number of ways, sort of a mission statement, right, for people who are thinking about this in the context of either delivering data-driven apps or selecting sort of analytical tools for the non-traditional data user. But if you look at sort of the action words here at the end of the definition, to us it's all about being three things, right? Being accessible, which sort of implies the masses, right? It's about being understandable, I can do this myself, and it's also about being actionable, because in every case, in a consumer role or in our business role, we're working on some task, and we'd like data to help us get closer to completing that task. So what does this mean sort of from the perspective of delivering, I guess, insights in a big data context? I mean, this is sort of another representation of that concept that also came out of the study, and it's sort of the notion of the data funnel. And if you will, it's, I guess, a collection of the processes and componentry that we think goes into this transformation of multi-source big data at the top. And if you look into the study, and certainly anybody who wants a copy of it, it's available both from Actuate and from Digital Clarity Group, there's at least three types of data here, right? There's the social data that's been added to the mix over the last few years. There's all the transactional historical data that's been around for a while. And then there's the online data that in a lot of cases informs sort of what we know about behavior, what we know about what content is popular, what we know about what products get associated with what other purchases, et cetera. So when we talk about sort of the top of the funnel here, we're talking about a blending and a need to access all of those types of data from different systems, from your web tracking, from your social monitoring, et cetera. So that's kind of how we think about the top of the data funnel. And then as we go through this, there's obviously tools that are involved for collecting up and for processing this data, for actually developing insights and applications. And then the bottom of the funnel is really where we've collected, we've composed, and now we've connected these insights with basically the individuals who need to do useful things with this data. And this might be presented in the form of a visualization, it might be presented in the form of a dashboard, et cetera. But to me, this is kind of the broad goal, is to think about how we can take insights, how we can turn it into action, and then obviously in the course of sort of this presentation, how do we turn that action into real change, both in terms of culture but also in terms of the experience that the end consumer gets to basically benefit from.
Alan, it seems Tim might have a little technical issue with his audio. I think he's going to try to dial back in. So.
Okay. Well, that's just on cue, because actually the last part of our discussion I was going to lead us through in terms of how do we start to operationalize some of these ideas. So this is what I wanted to focus on for the next 10 minutes or so, which is some of the learnings that we've had within the team that we have at Actuate in terms of what have we learned for best practices about getting this best picture of customer needs, what to me is sort of this necessary ingredient that then drives new types of programs, new types of initiatives that ultimately changes the dial in terms of loyalty, and also helps to create more of a customer-centric culture when we're able to create these feedback loops. Because to me, back at the beginning, we talked about the notion of fast being the new big. If we think fast and we sort of shorten the time scale, we think that there's a lot of good things that happen. It not only helps to reinforce culture, but it also helps you if you're a marketer or if you're focused on a certain operational need. If you can get these insights and actions into market, quote unquote, faster, you can get feedback, you can replan, you can relaunch a campaign, et cetera. So in a way, thinking fast is the shortest path, pun intended, to empowering an organization that really is customer-centric. So let me dig into a little bit about what we actually mean here when we talk about thinking fast. So it all goes back to the customer, right? So some of the opening points that Dr. Tim talked about are about how can we think about what the new consumer wants. We'd love to have a strategy in terms of aligning our assets, both data assets and cultural assets, but to me really go back to Tim's point about consumers having a choice and a voice. We need to think about customer insight in all of its forms, right? So if we're really going to understand the consumer, we have to think about them across all their different interaction points, what they've purchased, where they've visited, what they're saying on social, and then using these insights to create sort of this whole view, or what I mentioned before, sort of the best view of the customer. Now, this is a little different than the sort of 360-degree view that we've talked about sort of in CRM circles for a long time. As I've talked to more and more sort of customer experience owners, whether they're at banks or telcos or pharmas, this notion of the 360-degree view is still kind of mythical, but the best view of the customer is very much attainable. And so to me, this starts with thinking about kind of the best picture of customer needs. And how does this happen? We think it comes around to the idea of creating rich profiles. And this is sort of taking, I guess, a page out of the CRM playbook, where we talk about customer profiles, talk about rich profiles, which are sort of these enhanced profiles. To me, this is sort of the point one or step one of two in terms of really aligning sort of what consumers want with the culture, with very proactive, almost agile programming or planning from a perspective of whether you're in marketing or customer service or even in operations. So to me, the first ingredient is collecting data from all these different systems, right? So the systems, continue to multiply. The old ones don't go away. So back to the data funnel idea, we've got data coming from CRM, from ERP, from billing systems. We've got web data. We've got campaign data that's coming in, social data, of course. What we're really trying to do is create this rich profile, or maybe what might be termed a transmedia snapshot of customer engagement. It's actually related to a piece that I did for ZDNet at the end of last year, talking about how do we create this complete picture? We need to combine insights from all these sort of source systems. We need to get these all into one place, and this is where I guess the conversation becomes a little more technical, that there are some technical hurdles to getting this into one place, and then how do you act on this data quickly so that you can so-called think fast? We think, in our experience, that there's technologies that have emerged like columnar databases where you're starting to create more optimized places to provide this analytical sandbox. And I think this is a term that I've heard the folks at Forrester talk about, the notion of an analytical sandbox. I like it a lot because it really sort of represents a place where business users, business professionals, analysts can quote-unquote play around with this data and start to form some initial understanding about what customers want, where they're gathering, what their interests might be, what offers might be sticky, et cetera. And being able to do this in one place is essential, and also being able to do this very quickly is also essential. So to us, that's really sort of step one of two. And obviously from a data processing perspective, making sure that the data is clean and it's easy to load it, et cetera, those are all necessary ingredients as well. So this is step one of two from our perspective. The second step is, how do we think about doing this really quickly from an operational perspective? So, fast processing is really important. The notion of moving fast, we talk about failing fast and moving fast and being a fast follower, sort of proven business strategy, especially for very innovative companies. So there's an element of, if we can move quickly, we can do things in a meaningful fashion. So making decisions quickly, likewise, is to us foundational for being data-driven, and also seeing the results of these decisions in a timely fashion, which back to the theme around creating culture. If we're going to create a positive culture that's very responsive, we need to provide examples of how we've made changes and how there's impact of those changes, and feed that back into the organization. So if we can do this very quickly, then it's easier for the teams to sort of see, oh, we made this change, there was a positive impact, we're going to make additional change. So this, to me, is incredibly important just from the perspective of culture development, is being able to build in this sort of visible, rapid feedback. And then if we go back to how we can operationalize some of this, we need to be able to do things, obviously, at a time scale that allows us to take advantage of market opportunity. So for at least those two reasons, we think that fast is the new big in a lot of ways, and speed wins, not just because of time to market requirements, but also time to cultural change, if you will, requirements. So what does this mean from a, I guess, technological perspective? This is sort of the second part of the equation, or the other side of the coin, if you will. So to us, being focused and being fast is also about empowering the broadest set of users. Go back to the DCG study. How can we bring the value of big data to the masses, so to speak? We think that happens in a couple ways. One is we need to reduce scope. So we need to simplify to just the essentials, right? Just the answers, the data, the algorithms, the visuals that are needed for these business professionals to be able to do things like rapid segmentation, profiling of customers, optimizing a campaign, tailoring an experience, and being able to do this in a time scale that makes it incredibly easy to see the results. So in the old model, maybe we would create one model, and we release a monthly campaign. We get the data back. We have another several weeks to analyze the data, to bring it into the system, to get the data scientists to create the models. We do another campaign next month. In this new model, we want to be able to do really rapid turns. So we're talking about minutes and hours, not days and weeks. And again, the way that we think that you do this not only is having a super fast way to process the data, but also limit the scope of the sort of analytical techniques to just the essentials. And in our case, these are the things that allow you to explore the data, create some visuals, enrich it if need be, analyze those insights sort of within the frame of certain campaigns with workflow, allow visuals to be sort of the language of the data so that we can allow other members of the team to see and interact and do some iterations on the data, to share it, to collaborate. So to us, this starts with having sort of a preset number of algorithms, not everything in the world, but just the essentials. And this combination of very fast processing plus very focused set of algorithms is, to us, the key to sort of bringing this value to the masses of users, not just the select few sort of in the old model. Now, from a market perspective, if I sort of put my analyst hat on and sort of revisit some of the things that we thought about at Digital Clarity, and I've even thought about back to my, my McKinsey, my Yankee Group days, to me there's sort of a nice little 2x2 that emerges when we think about the notion of bringing big data to everyday work. And it's framed by sort of two dimensions, right? The number of sources and the volume of data. So in a way, this is sort of the traditional V's of big data in terms of volume and variety and maybe even velocity, the 3 V's. And then you look at sort of the time scale at which we're working. And if you think about sort of traditional campaign tools, there's been a revolution in terms of email and web and different types of social type campaign tools that really moved the notion of customer management from something that happened, again, in days to something that could happen literally in minutes. There's a whole different sort of, I guess, functional role of these tools. They tend to be very single channel. They have simple analytics, but they do really well in their specific area of focus. If we look at this intersection between this sort of notion of everyday, rapid, fast, agile tools and traditional big data, what we see emerging is sort of this new kind of type of advanced analytics that's tailored to business users. It's very visual, so we might call this sort of advanced visual business analytics, not that I'm proposing that's the term. But to us, this is the key to making the use of these tools very broad-based, but also making real change and making it in minutes and hours, not in weeks and months, which going back to the theme of the event, we think is essential to not only delivering business value very quickly, but also creating that type of feedback loop within your culture so that I can see the result of this campaign this afternoon. I can share that with my team. They can share it with their teams, and we can create these very rapid turns through data where we're seeing impact, we're studying the result, we're tuning, we're doing this over and over again. We think that this is essential to create real meaningful cultural change, but we also think it requires the ability to pull in this multi-source data very quickly. It includes things like just the essential analytical techniques, but also if we want business users to do this, this is not your father's BI tool or your father's big data tool. This has got to be a tool that doesn't really require any coding, and that's really been the focus of the efforts around Bird Analytics at Actuate. So let me bring Tim back in to our recap here. We've covered a lot in terms of the market drivers, in terms of the cultural drivers, in terms of what's happening in terms of the changing face of the consumer. what we wanted to do is sort of recap and provide a little bit of color here before we get into Q&A. But to me, just starting off, if you haven't been convinced, I think there's a lot of data that points to the fact that we need a new way of thinking about customers, because customers, in fact, have changed in fundamental ways over the last decade. And we need to think differently about consumers, and differently about their data, and differently about how we can really serve those consumers in a fashion that they want to be served, but also that'll be additive in terms of the understanding we have, so we can basically sell them more stuff.
Yeah, just to reiterate that or underscore that, Alan, it says on the slide it's time to create a new way of thinking about customers and so forth. It's time because it's necessary. So if it wasn't clear from some of the metrics that I was showing earlier, you either get this, begin to get customer experience right, or you will not belong for the world. I've been writing recently about Business 2020, and that's barely 5 years away. And by then, our expectations and demands as consumers are going to continue to just race forward. We're going to be looking for really what PwC, in fact, in a recent study calls perfect execution of omni-channel customer experiences. So pretty much seamless interactions and relevant information delivery across, potentially 25 different interactions and 7 different touch points over 3 or 4 months. And trying to achieve that kind of thing today for most companies, it seems like a monstrous challenge, and yet it's going to be necessary to do something very, very close to that simply in order to obtain and retain customers in the near future.
And Tim, this is a point that you've made. Going back to some of the events that we did together, this is not your choice, right? This is I remember your slide with gravity doesn't care, right? That this is happening
right
without you.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the Clayton Christensen formulation. You may hate gravity, but gravity doesn't care. And I always advise people to think of customer experience management and the challenge of delivering on customer experience as gravity. You may want to avoid that because it seems difficult and complicated and maybe even expensive, but you really don't have a choice.
I mean, against that, I guess sobering reality is the second point, which, the good news, I guess, is from our study, our analysis, from the work that we're doing right now at Actuate, that we think there are practical steps organizations can take, that the notion of sort of bringing the power of big data to the masses and operationalizing advanced analytics, is actually doable if we chunk down the problem, if we simplify, if we think small, so to speak, if we can think about ways to empower users with just the right insight, with visuals that tell a story, that make it easier to consume the data and to understand it, and that can inform not only sort of the strategies for marketers or for planners, but also the end experiences themselves, that there is an emerging playbook to do this. And in a lot of ways, we think that it does start by chunking down the problem and doing things in practical, measured steps, but there are a lot of ways you can do that right now.
Yeah, and this imperative is unavoidable. That's why it's an imperative. And so in a certain way, no step is too small. You don't want to get paralyzed by the immensity of the challenge and think, well, if we do that, it's not going to be enough. Well, it's more than you're doing now. So even if you just begin to offer if you begin to empower, say your marketing team with even early insights into something they can act on in order to optimize or improve customer experiences, that's better than what you're doing today. It gets you moving in the right direction, and you can begin to learn from it to improve in the future.
And I guess that's
Alan and Tim, I want to jump just so we have time for questions. We only have a little bit more time. Do you want to do a real quick wrap-up, and then we'll jump into the Q&A?
Absolutely. So let me end on this third point, which just amplifies some of the, I guess, examples I just gave. Is we think along that path of practical steps is thinking about how you can quickly assemble these rich profiles, that in a lot of cases organizations have that data. It's just sort of a question of wiring it up, number one. And number two, we think that you have a team full of, and an organizational possibility of getting many more people involved in this decision making in the data if you start to think about delivering sort of the power of predictive or advanced analytics to everyday users with some of the approaches we talked about. And so I think the more that you wire up the organization to get to expose themselves to that data, so to speak, the more that they can make informed decisions, the more that the organization becomes agile. The notion of fast analytics supports that agility, and then so on and so on. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that the more insights that you can deliver, the more you make those insights consumable by the masses. Via tools like Bird Analytics, to put in a plug, we think that you'll create really a culture that wants more data, that will be accepting of more ways to play with the data, and so on and so on. So the more that you bring that value to the masses, the more that your organization wants more data and starts to think about the world, I think, in this new style that we've discussed. So with that, let's definitely take some questions, because I've seen some on Twitter, and also I know we have some that came in through the on 24 as well.
Okay, great. Nice job, Dr. Tim and Alan. You guys did a very good presentation. So I want to jump right into the questions. Just to let everybody know that's viewing, you can see that I've just put the slide that has both Alan and Tim's contact information. If you have additional questions following today's event, you can reach out to them directly. And I'll leave this slide up during the Q&A portion. We had a few questions coming in on the topic of privacy, so I'm going to have that be the first question. Customers want to be known in their interactions with companies, yet they also have a pronounced concern about privacy. How do you strike that balance?
Yeah. So I'll take a quick shot at this. It's a huge question and topic, and we don't have time to begin to address it. But I think that there's a lot of data emerging, a lot of surveys, and what's I think becoming clear, although it's not definitive yet, is that all the on the one hand, people, and that includes me and all of us, I think, have a concern about privacy. Where is the company getting the information? What are they doing with it? Who are they sharing it with? Are they selling it to someone behind my back, and so forth? All of those things are very real anxieties. On the other hand, when it comes down to the interaction and the experiences that we're having with a company or a brand, as we saw in my data from the UK, we want to be known. And I think that my provisional answer is that many consumers, and personally this is true for me, will trade off so-called personal information for an improved experience. We saw that consumers are willing to pay for a better experience. I think part of that payment can be giving a company information about myself. If I can see that I'm getting a benefit from it in terms of a more relevant, a more appropriate, a faster, a smarter response on the part of the company.
Okay, very good. Alan, do you want to add, or should I jump to the next question?
Only 2 words: be useful. If you're useful, I think people are willing to share more of their data.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. The next question is, what consumer trend is having the biggest impact on the way businesses collect and use customer insights?
So I'll take a quick cut at this, although Dr. Tim certainly covered a number of these trends in the opening. Social networking has created a whole different dynamic, not only in terms of how people can share their experiences with peers and in some cases complete strangers, but also what we learn from them in terms of sort of the color commentary on the products and experiences and what they like and what they don't like. So I think this has really been one of the more fundamental drivers for how we have to think about consumers, and also what types of data we can gather from them. Secondarily, certainly ubiquity and mobility, and being able to sort of interact with consumers on new types of devices in new places. I think both of those are not only incredible sources of data that sort of go into this rich profile, but also provide sort of a different type of relationship with consumers and how they relate to other consumers as well.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, unfortunately, I think that's going to have to be the last question. We're just out of time. So I want to make sure that everybody that has asked questions, thank you for taking the time to participate. And rest assured, all questions are going to be sent to Tim and Alan in Actuate, and they will respond to you directly. I just want to make a couple of quick announcements to please mark your calendars. for June 10th and our next Data Science Central webinar, Hadoop Automation, Eliminating Data Bottlenecks, sponsored by Chase3. This brings our webinar to a close. I'd like to thank our audience again for attendance and thoughtful questions, and a special thank you to Actuate for sponsoring today's event, and to both Tim and Alan for their insight into today's topic. My name is Tim Madison. I'm very pleased to have been your host for today's event, and I look forward to seeing you all again on June 10th. Good day.